How are we all today? Can people hear me? Do I sound, well, not great, but about as normal as ever I could? How are we all doing today? Are we having a good time? Is it a good Wednesday afternoon? No one says anything. I still simply assume no one's here. So, on tap for today, we are going to be speaking to Shakespeare for a little bit about Palestine and Israel and all of the associated issues. I'm not entirely certain where we are going to land on this today, so it should be interesting at the very least. With that should be in about 5-10 minutes. Until then, what has I want to show this off because it's fantastic. And we're probably going to be playing this on stream when it comes out in a couple months. Oop. This is a trailer for a game being published by Microprose. And if you are of a certain age, you will remember Microprose. If you are not of a certain age, you're not of a certain age, then you won't. But Microprose used to do a lot of simulators when they were back in vogue in the late 90s, early 2000s. They did a lot of things like military simulators, Jane's. Like it's not as big as it used to be, but there used to be a massive market for these things when I was a kid. And some of these games I played because there was no chance I was going to turn out normal. So they did a lot of flight sims and whatnot. And this is a trailer for Sea Power, which is going to be their new kind of naval simulator, such as it is.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. Lord, guard and guide the men who fly, and those who on the ocean ply. Be with our troops upon the land, and all who for their country stand. Be with these guardians day and night, and may their trust be in thy might. Creator Father, grant, we pray, to those who serve both night and day, who stretch their rigs across the sea to service ships where'er they be. Oh, bless their efforts cross the foam and bring them ever safely home.
All right, no game trailer has that. No game trailer has that much right to go that hard. Is yeah, no game trailer has the right to go that hard. But like this is kind of exciting because you haven't seen games like Harpoon Classic or Fleet Command in quite some time. There hasn't really been a market for these kind of in-depth simulation games or what you call it. But like my dad was a big fan of flight simulators too. Like basically they were titled after the machine in question. So like F-15, Flight Eagle, blah 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 blah. And like I've seen them come back sort of, but not like the mass market type thing that we have in the past. So that'll be fun to see, like kind of coming back as like a notion of like it's good to see these kinds of games return, I think. Well, yeah, that's kind of the intention, is to make it seem chilling, right? Ultimately. The spoken words that the narrator is using is actually a hymn that was written in the United Kingdom called Eternal Father. And it has become the traditional hymn for the American and British maritime services. It's actually really well done. There is a version done by the U.S. Navy Band on YouTube. Eternal Father, U.S. Navy Band. The album is Victory at Sea, and it's a really well done, like moving hymn. So, like for example, my grandfather was in the Navy, and when he passed away, this was one of the hymns they played at his funeral service. So it has a certain amount of cachet. All right, I'm going to message Shakespeare, and we're going to get this thing going. Sunday's up. Oh, well. All right, we're just waiting on them to come in whenever they're ready. Let's see how this goes. We don't know until we get there, right? In other news, Hetman will be getting a new PC this coming weekend, I think. He has been computerless for a little bit after his hard drive crashed and his battery pack expanded. No relation to anything that happened recently in Lebanon. Basically, it killed his laptop. So he has been out of commission for a little bit, and he will be coming back. In other news, I will be replacing this microphone this month, I have decided. Because I can. Thank you to the generous donations from our patrons who have made that possible. you may, if you wish, join that patron right here. We'll be getting a better microphone, trying to up some of the stuff and deal with some of the issues we've had. Other than that, I have been writing and reading and writing and reading for video essays mostly. Again, I jumped into that as soon as humanly possible. The progress is not fast. First of all, my writing process is as slow as everyone else's. Let's see. There we go. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
All right, let's pop this out. All right, how is it?
Okay.
Read that. There we go. How's it going?
It's going so far so good. How about for you?
It's okay.
There we go.
It's a nice Wednesday so far.
Okay. That's good to hear. That's good to hear. Just one quick second. I just need to fix one last thing. And then we should be good. Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, so if I actually would want to know if you actually would like to introduce yourself, because I know we talked well jokingly about Clausewitz and all of that stuff, but I do know that you're into military history and all of that. But I would like if you would like to go in depth on
Sure.
about your background and expertise.
So my name is Daedalus Media, and I am one half of the channel Two Guys Talking History. I particularly have focused on American military history. However, my channel partner, Hetman, he is the Ukrainian studies, and specifically the Holocaust in Ukraine background, where he studied history. So together, we made this channel to sort of talk about issues. And unfortunately, the way the world's been going, mostly what we do is we talk about war. So that's kind of the background I come out of. I am a kidney disease patient, but before that, when I was in college, I was an Army ROTC cadet, an Army officer cadet. So that's kind of where that background comes from, and a lot of connections I've made from there. So that's kind of my story. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well, because we haven't talked before.
Yeah, sure. Just apparently I need to fix my audio just a little bit because
yeah,
okay.
I'm naturally quiet.
I'm Shakespeare. I am a cultural historian, and my fields of expertise are in Jewish history and Latin American history. And I'm currently working on an article series that eventually I will try to expand on and edit into a book on the history. Let me see. Sorry, I made myself louder, not you. So I need to. There we go. That should help. That should help. Yes, that eventually I plan on making into a book and hopefully finding some academic press that will take it. But right now it's still very embryonic. So yeah.
Kind of monograph style then?
Yes. Well, see, that's the thing is I'm not sure, because I'm more than willing to do an edited collection. I just would need to know people who I know would be committed to going into those different aspects of history from 1917 to 1950. Which I mean, if you were to do it from a military history perspective, for example, I mean, you definitely have all of that time period with the British and everything, right, to write about. So yeah.
Well, yeah, that's, I think, probably a good place to start in. 1917 onward is a particularly difficult time, I think, for the Palestinians because they're just getting this grounding in the sense of self and the sense of personhood and this sense of like identity, right? And it's being gradually stripped away from them as they're watching it as it forms, right? So I think that's probably a lot more interesting from a cultural perspective than anything else.
Mhm. Yeah, so what I've been sort of looking into is kind of like what were the conditions that specifically made it so that when Britain was finally given the mandate, and you know how precisely the British, via their choices, right, to stifle growth in vis-a-vis the Palestinians, whilst allowing like industrialization and education to be more open when it came to the Zionist settlers, how that like set up a disparity between the two communities that kind of has never really, been overcome, and if anything has just devolved, ever since. So
Yeah, I think the source I've been consulting most for what the research I've been working on this is around Camp David in 2000 or 1999 rather in 2000. But like I've been looking at Rashid Khalidi's book, 100 Years War in Palestine, and he does an excellent job in kind of illustrating the ways in which the relationships were forged there between the Zionist community in Europe and the government in London and the administrators and the mandate and the Palestinians and the Zionist settlers there. And it's really remarkable. Like there's a lot of a lot of the classic give or take that you see in decolonization processes happens in Palestine, only to be co-opted by the government in London. So like it was a very effective two-pronged movement, right, of settlement and political pressure on the European power in question to kind of give the burgeoning Israeli state this power and this ability to prosecute their objectives. And it reads like, I don't think Khalidi does a very I don't think he's horrifyingly biased. Like he's very clearly a Palestinian writing about Palestinian issues, but I don't he does a good job of illustrating like the no-win nature that the Palestinian leadership as it was at that time was in. Like they're not really a cohesive whole yet. They don't have these institutions that can effectively take over a country like happens in Egypt or Jordan, right? They're trying to build these things and they're being stifled by the British. And it's working to their advantage. For the the proto-Israeli state, right? Because that gives them the ability to further industrialize and exploit things like, or build cities and all that. And it kind of leads into this situation where you have it in the 30s, the Palestinian uprising, where they just turn over and arm Israeli groups that eventually ended up becoming terrorist groups that attacked the Egyptian or the British.
right, and like one of the things that I find quite, and also please let me know, those of you in chat, if the sound is okay now. I really want to make sure I got the sound down. But yes, I found that quite interesting, especially because of the fact that you had, for example, like, and in the article series, I begin, beforehand in 1896 and even slightly prior, because I have to discuss, or I felt I needed to introduce, right, like one of the big aspects, which is the Hashemites, right, and the British already doing like deals with the Hashemites even back then, but in the lead up to World War One, how and how they had promised, right, that they would give the Hashemites essentially a large Arab state, right, if they would revolt
Against the Ottomans.
Yes, against the Ottomans. Oh yeah, sorry. I was trying to read a chat. It says here, if they're saying, one is saying, if you could boost your output to me, that would be nice. But
Let me check.
Um, but yes, against the Ottomans, that was, particularly after the House of Saud kicked out the Hashemites from being um, in the Waqf of Makkah, and then them essentially being expelled, but still trying to have some claim and going to Al Qahira or Cairo. So then that way they could still claim the land that they thought they were going to get, right? And so them essentially getting three kingdoms, right? One which was the shortest lived, which was one which was supposed to be to stop French domination or French colonization in the Middle East, which didn't end up panning out, which was Syria, and then you had Transjordan and Iraq, which is where the failed king of Syria was then sent off to. So I kind of wanted to put all of that into context, right? That like the British already had all of these plans to do these things with the Hashemites, and that is also why, like when you have the conferences that happen, again in the aftermath of World War I, you have like the Jordanian king, right, specifically meeting with the Zionists and saying, well, if you let me control Palestine, I'll give you like an autonomous province in exchange, right? So the fact that like the Jordanians have always been kind of collaborators to some extent, right, more or less, from the beginning, things like that.
Well, yes, but at the same time, those were like also colonial powers, either controlled by the French or the British. So they at a certain extent have to play ball with the objectives of the French or the British, and that's how they gain their own independence over time, right? It's also markedly different than the situation in Palestine. So like Egypt is a crown colony, basically. They have a significant amount of leeway in what rights they give to the Egyptians for when the Egyptians become their own country, to let them build up that infrastructure that they need. The League of Nations mandate is incredibly specific and incredibly exclusionary to the Palestinians. And it's that mandate that the European Zionists keep pushing back on in London every time they try to give the Palestinians more autonomy throughout that period up till the 48 War of Independence, right? So like it's really the thing about the mandate of Palestine is it's somewhat unique for the region. It's not the same kind of colonization that we would talk about Egypt or Italy and Libya or other areas. It's much more restrictive, because there's like an objective behind it that they're pushing this state. And like I mentioned the 30s and the Palestinian revolt against the British. But it's worth noting that in the 40s, when the Zionists felt that the mandate was becoming too restrictive for immigration, they launched their own revolt against the British, starting in 1944. That took up 100,000. 100,000 British troops were engaged in peacekeeping operations at that point, basically at the falling action of World War II. So it's not a clear-cut relationship, I think. The British are trying to, at a certain extent, moderate the two interests, but they're never really an honest actor, because they're an actor who is aiming for the creation of Israel. So like it causes the Palestinians like an imbalance that they can't ever really rectify, and that Israel today is dedicated to keeping. I have been looking very particularly at the quote unquote peace process. Now, kind of the specifically, I focusing on Camp David, between the Clinton attempt at Camp David to establish a Palestinian state, kind of as like an example of the processes that would come afterwards. And Clayton Swisher has written a book, The Truth About Camp David, which I found to be a fabulous resource so far. He is an American journalist who worked for Al Jazeera, which explains why he gets next to no support from Israel in the book, like no interviews, but a lot from the United States and Syria and whatnot. And it's really remarkable how that process of playing the Palestinians off of one another has continued even to the present day. Uh, so, like for example, you've got Hamas and how they play Hamas off of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, and how the formation of the Palestinian Authority was even then in the 90s to uh, dilute the power of moderate Palestinians who were calling for statehood and the revocation of the settlements. Um, Israel has never been an honest actor in this peace process, if you really get down to it. And the
Right.
United States has been party to that. We've helped them in that, and I personally, as an American, find that unacceptable.
Right. And like that's one of those things too where you really see, right, especially with something like if I can use a much more contemporary example, like when Trump recognized, right, the Golan Heights as pertaining to the state of Israel, right, even though they are still occupied territories, right, of Syria, right. And in
Yes.
fact, most of like that is another, thing where it's like now there is a direct acknowledgement, so to speak, of that colonization, and it is with direct U.S. support that now the official U.S. State Department map has to includes that as if there were no blue line as it would have been, um, and so then that also adds into playing the Druze and the Palestinians and the Syrians and just like all of these different actors, right? Which is something that, if I may just quickly note, is also something that was done during the incursion into Lebanon in 1982. Like that was something where the Phalangist, right, the Maronite Christian militias were allied with the IDF, but then you had like the Palestinians on the other side who were being victimized by both the Phalangists and the IDF. So yeah, it's definitely uh, the methodology of the IDF, etc. So
It's not an uncommon tactic throughout history, throughout various groups, play one ethnic group off the other. Is a pretty common uh, is a pretty common, I guess, trope is the best word for it. And you see
mhm,
it in other places. Like it for an expansionist power, it generally tends to play to their interests to do that. So
mhm.
one of the things that I've been looking at, and I've never comfortable with, is people who try to compare what Israel is doing to Nazi Germany. And like, I get it, the Holocaust is one of the foremost things in people's minds, but in my mind, what Israel has done over the course of its existence is much more akin to how the United States treated our indigenous populations, and Canada to a lesser extent. This kind of playing them off of one another, negotiating, then violence, and this process of pushing outward slowly and kind of chipping it away like a slow moving ethnic cleansing is really kind of how Israel has operated by and large. Um, so it's however it's a very compressed time frame, whereas like America did this over 400 years, Israel has done this over the course of 80. Um,
Right, right. And in fact, I think Elon Pape, I can't remember the exact term he uses, but he does call it kind of like I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something like a protracted ethnic cleansing, something along those lines. So yeah, that definitely aligns with kind of what you're describing, right? The commonality between like the conquest of the West, right, in the United States, and then Israel as it's trying to, particularly in the West Bank, right?
well, it's notable, I think, that um, and it's hard for me to judge because Israel kicking off with Gaza is a once every 2 year thing at this point. Um, to the point where when it happened the night of, I was talking to some people, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, there's a Hamas incursion happening in Israel right now," and it was late. It was late here for me, but it was morning in Israel on October 7th when all this was happening. The scale wasn't immediately apparent to me, and even after the scale of Hamas's attack was apparent, I still didn't necessarily believe that Israel was going to attack Gaza with such absolute disregard for the conventions of warfare. Basically, it was unprecedented. Like, it would have made sense, and I would have expected something along the lines of previous incursions they've made to strike out at targets, which cause civilian casualties and are immensely damaging to the Palestinian people. But the absolute scale of what's happened over the last year or so in Gaza has been, I don't know if it's precedented. As a matter of fact, even the conservative casualty figures, I think, are the most severe that it's been since the Nakba in 48, 49.
Right. And of course, there is the fact that what's happening sort of in Gaza is also something that the reasoning why I think it's also just on a completely different scale, and why some people certainly did not think, was because the response came back so quickly, and then so much of the justification and uh and also the like things like the usage of the Samson directive, etc., right? Like, were used right away, right? And were revealed to have happened, right? And have only, goes on, right, been shown to have been the case than not. You also have like that issue with Zaka where like they were given they were President Biden talked about it, but then it turns out that that was fabricated, and that's kind of what we were speaking a little bit about prior to us starting our conversation. But yes, and another thing too is that it is being compared to other genocides, in particular Rwanda, because of its speed, right? Because Rwanda lasted 100 days of, thereabout. And so people have made this, like the people that are making these comparisons, CJ and the ICC, but also just, genocide study scholars, et cetera, right? Like, can we consider this a genocide? Which, I mean, I know we were kind of alluding to the fact that people want to see it as an instantiation of a particular prior one, right? But definitely, like, I've seen the people trying to see the metrics, right, and trying to say, oh, it's happening faster than, at a faster rate than Rwanda did, right? Or, on an even more severe scale than Srebrenica in terms of, so it's definitely one of those things where, like, the different disciplines, right, that kind of discuss these things, right, from history to international law to, et cetera, are themselves, still in wait to begin actually investigating and actually coming with even beginning to ask the questions that will, one day bear a conclusion, right? So
Yeah, I think there is a certain amount of this that defies our ability to kind of process it on a certain level. There are definitely bad actors who are trying to obscure things. Yeah, I don't know what to do about to fix that, guys. I think it's just connection problems. Complain to my homeowners association. Sorry. No, there is there's a certain amount of this that defies our ability to process it on a level two. So, like, for example, when the UN reports came out from the Commission about October 7th, and just the 2 months, or rather the 3 months, October into December, that they've investigated and released a report on so far, the scale is just almost incomprehensible on a certain level. You're basically watching this in real time. It's like, it's very difficult, particularly when we talk about Israel, because Israel is kind of poorly understood here in America. We have a very bad relationship with Israel in a certain sense. You have those evangelical Christians who look at Israel in this kind of unhealthy way where they want the country to exist to bring about the apocalypse, and you have the Israelis who take advantage of that. Um, we have sat through a great deal of propaganda in the United States talking about how Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And that's just not the case anymore. Likud, or a party relatively close to Likud, has been in power now for nigh on 30 years. They've effectively become a one-party state. And the things that Israel says in the past, there was that whole bit with the Jewish Chronicle where they uncritically published government reports. All of that has turned into a state where, like, we don't get good information out of Israel anymore, and it's very hard to do these investigations. The thing that I'm most afraid of is that we will never really get conclusive evidence, that it's always going to sit in this gray debate zone, because, like, no one denies that Rwanda was a genocide. Rwanda itself is, despite its problems, very much set on fixing that legacy. No one denies that Cambodia, for example, was a genocide. They are going to argue this, and Israel's going to make it that it's an arguable gray area for a very long time. And in that, there might not ever really be a restitution available to the Palestinians.
Yes, I mean, especially because there are also the historical consequences of the Nakba and the Nukhba, right, which is 48, 49, well, technically starting in 47, but still, that's besides the point. And also 67, and now this, right? In particular because of the fact that you have the whole-scale destruction of any chance of habitability in the Gaza Strip, right? Like I was mentioning to chat before, that the estimation currently, as it stands, is that it would take about 20 years just to clear the rubble. And so that is before you could even begin to build anything back in Gaza. You would have to remove all the rubble because there's like unexploded ordnance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all this stuff that's there that you can't really do until then. But we also won't ever know, like, for example, like the true figure of the fatalities, right? That's why, like, when Ralph Nader and earlier, like in June, with the Lancet saying it could be as much as 186,000, or when Ralph Nader came out with the other report by other scholars that had mentioned that it's a sense that they are estimating it's about 300,000 fatalities as of when it was published. I mean, that's 1 in 6 Gazans having passed, right? But we don't know, right? Like that's something that we just don't
We don't have
will
the
not
data.
be it. Yeah, exactly. Like there's no way we could ever know. Like we only know whatever whenever the health ministry itself is able to connect an individual with their Israeli provided identification numbers. That's it.
Yeah,
So, and mhm.
that's been a problem that I've kind of sat on for a while. When I talk about this, I generally tend to cite the Gaza Health Ministry's current figures because they're bad enough. 160,000 casualties, about 40,000 dead, 10,000 missing, and over 120,000 wounded, right? That's bad enough to be getting on with, to talk about the concept of genocide. But like the reality is that the systems inside Gaza are functionally gone. There isn't really a functioning system anymore that can support the people of Gaza or even keep track of those things. So as this has gone on, it is reasonable to assume that the death toll is significantly higher. And that's going to turn into like the after effects of a conflict too, right? You don't just have the people who die in the conflict, you have the people who die because the services have collapsed. There's basically no hospital system standing in Gaza, to my understanding, at this point, that's safe. And that the way that Israel has repeatedly targeted those hospitals has been unconscionable. Uh,
Yes, for sure. And especially now that it's begun also to do that in parts of the West Bank, right? Particularly in Tulkarm and also Jenin, right? It's just like where, you have the PA that, disarmed so many people in the West Bank and everything. But yes, when it comes to Gaza, I forget how many times they've like besieged Al Ahli hospital, but it's like more than three times from what I can recall just off the top of my head, where they've besieged the same hospital. You already have, I mean, essentially for example, the hospital morgue is non-functional because there's nothing they can do. I mean, there's nothing that they can do to help preserve or to, you know what I mean? Like all of the stuff that is typically done,
yes.
just because the casualty rate is so high, and even basic anesthetics, let alone the stuff for embalming, etc., is just gone. So in terms of that, like that's another thing, right? And we do know that we are gonna when there begins to be the start of some of those investigations, we are going to find things that, you know, even now we did not expect there to be. Like right now, people are saying, oh, we know we're going to find possibly, mass graves here, there, blah, 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 whatever. But even that is like, we honestly just do not even comprehend the scale because, when you have 2 million people trapped in this very small, 25-mile by 7-mile space, with almost 6 nuclear bombs at Hiroshima in terms of kilotonnage dropped on them already. It's like, honestly, I am not expecting even in a decade to even have accurate, estimates that we can assess, right, or try to make some try to really comprehend the scale of what's going on for sure.
There is, to my mind, and it keeps playing in the back of my mind as I'm doing this like research. Gaza basically is functionally destroyed. I'm not entirely certain it's ever recoverable, particularly given the continuation of the circumstances. Because this is another thing that Israel's great at. They're absolutely fantastic at leveling infrastructure that the Palestinian Authority or Hamas would need to become a legitimate government and stay a legitimate government, and then blaming them for the lack of their inability to provide services. And like, this is that on a massive scale. And it, like, let's suppose that tomorrow they get a ceasefire in place. Best case scenario, we kick off again in 2026. It's like clockwork. Every 2 years, there's a Gaza fight, right? Best case scenario is this starts all over again in 2 years, and they never get a chance to recover. The only real solution at hand here is a peace treaty, an actual one, and that's problematic because there's so many things like built into the assumption of the two-state solution that just screw Palestine over. The two-state solution, as it's been advanced by Israel, isn't a state, to be perfectly frank. It sets them up for failure. Even if you hand over the entire West Bank, kick out all the settlers, not a small prospect, by the way, and let them rebuild Gaza, they need massive investment to even build like an economy to do any of this in the first place. There's every thought in the world to me that, like, suppose we get a peace treaty tomorrow, it'll just turn into a failed state.
Right. And I mean, the way how I've always sort of and the way how I've always shorthanded it, right, and is the two-state solution is the apartheid solution, right? At least that is then the most basic way I could describe it, because what you're saying is true, right? There is no functional state that could be on one. They could retake and rehouse, rehabilitate, etc. The millions of refugees, right? That have the right to return, right? And this was something that the UN has said so. The ICJ has said so, right? In its advisory opinion, right? And and also here's just one quick point too that I want to make, since I mentioned the ICJ thing. I actually did not expect for the case, for the advisory opinion about the West Bank and Gaza to even be considered by the court. Like, the fact that they did say that yes, Israel is occupying the West Bank and Gaza, and that it needs to remove the settlers and I would have never have thought. I mean, because before, such cases were just like never really allowed in the first place. They were never like taken up by the court. So to have seen it happen, right? But like, yes, you're right. Like, in the sense that Palestine, especially even now, is made so that it is, it is failed, right? It was never, it wasn't failing at any point. It was failed, a priori, essentially.
Yeah, you posted today the concept of a one-state solution into the cathedral discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I get that it's heresy to suggest it, but that might be the only viable long-term solution region. The problem that you encounter at that point is that Israel, the Israeli right, and that's much of the country, to be frank, is invested in the concept of an ethno-state, which is detrimental to Israel in the long term, because it's going to basically guarantee that Israel collapses itself. Ethno-states are bad ideas. They are inherently reactionary, so they have to stand opposed to basically the changing of time and how cultures evolve over time. You already see those deep divisions in Israeli society, particularly over the last 2 years, but even before October 7th, when they were having those protests about the changing of the courts and this further power grab by Netanyahu and Likud broadly. So like Israel itself would have been a failed state. Like, people forget how bleak Israel was in the 40s and 50s. Very poor, very aggressively, like, difficult conditions for a lot of people who are moving there. By and large, what allowed Israel to succeed is a massive amount of foreign investment from very dedicated people outside of Israel. And like a two-state solution would basically, to do that, Palestine would need not these requirements that Israel has control of their borders and their water and their foreign relations. They would need their own ability to do that, and they need an expat faction that is willing to do that as well. So like, the two-state solution would either require such a massive investment of reparations, and I think there's a case to be made. There's obviously a case to be made for Israel and the United States, but there's probably a case to be made for the United Kingdom paying those reparations too. But even that wouldn't be sufficient to do the kind of heavy lifting and nation building that we have to envision there.
Right, especially because you have, and I believe I had also mentioned this in that somewhere in that discussion earlier about when there was discussion about lawsuits, right? And I was bringing up the fact that in Canada, they had recently gotten rid of the charitable status, or the charity status, of the JNF, or the Jewish National Fund, right?
Yeah.
Because that was one of the principal organizations that in the United States loves to sell itself as innocuous. In fact, there are shows even going back to like the 70s. I can't even remember what the show is, but like, they have someone dress up as a rabbi. I know it's just like, old television, old American television. And then they start saying, what are you trying to get me to do? Buy trees for your country, right? But that is something that the JNF does, right? It tries to sell itself as like, oh, we will plant a tree in your name. We will blah, 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 right? They even have an investment arm where you can get like, if you donate it all to the JNF, all your life savings, essentially, right, you get an annuity, essentially. which is in my mind ridiculous. But the main thing is like the purchase and expulsion of Palestinians early on, like this is pre 1948, was done by organizations like like the JNF, and even to this day, a lot of the land that is stolen, and then deeds are made that are Israeli, and they don't, et cetera, like all the different methods that are used. So many of those are tied to the JNF using the excuse of them planting trees or them dedicating something. And usually, and this is what I found to be so strange, is that the JNF is known to have uprooted like 1,000-year-old olive trees in order to plant trees that are invasive. I mean, in the sense that they are foreign trees, especially in northern Israel, to the point where now Israel, which I mean, historical Palestine never was known for having large wildfires. Now it is, because they planted a whole bunch of pine trees, right? Like European pine trees, and they dry up and catch fire. And so it's like this really weird like thing where it's like, yeah, you're kind of doing the thing, but in a really, in a sort of in an abstracted way, like the settler colonialism project via these trees. But yes, like it would require there to be also the reparations that were paid not to the Holocaust survivors themselves, right? This was something that the Jewish Agency for Israel lobbied, and especially, the United States. I mean, Norman Finkelstein writes about this in the Holocaust industry, but there are other people that have written about this. But, most prominently, his book goes into this, that Germany, instead of setting it up so that people could apply to like Germany's foreign ministry or whatever it might be, instead the state of Israel said, we will take the money and then disperse it. But it never really did that. In fact, there are people who to this day that were survivors of concentration camps that never received anything, not one red cent from the reparations that Germany paid out. And because I just spoke about Norman, his mother only got a one-time payment of like $2,500, and that was it. Like they never paid her anything else.
It's probably worth noting that most Holocaust survivors who live in Israel live there in poverty. Extreme poverty, as a matter of fact. So, like, Israel has never been there's a lot to go into any discussion of reparations, I think. Like how you distribute that and how it works. There's probably a lesson to be taken from our own formats for indigenous cultures and their current way they get money on reservations. There's a lot that can go wrong in reparations. I don't know. At the same time, I don't know how whole we could ever make someone from the Holocaust, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there is an advantage to the fact that, like, there's an idea in my head where, like, there's an advantage to giving it to a country that allows that country to invest that on that person's behalf. But that clearly hasn't happened in the case of Israel, because you again have this population that is this population that immigrated to Israel with the promise of having a Jewish state, who now live basically in poverty. And it's worse when you look at the systems around international relations with Israel, how much of an advantage they have. They don't have the same kind of restrictions that other countries do. They enjoy a lot of, when you get down to it, a lot of privileges, things that we wouldn't let anyone else get away with, in how they get funding and support.
Right. I mean, it was very strange to me when, when, is it Walter Masterson? Is that his name? But he did that thing where he was like, "Oh, I'm just a real estate agent, but I want to find out about like the land that they were trying to sell that's in Gaza, that they already were like parceling off and trying to like get investors in it." And I'm like, what a weird thing to like already try to get people to essentially get that pool of money knowing that when it comes down to it over justice for the Palestinians or a large pool of money in our capitalist world, they're going to choose a large pool of money. And that is one of those things, like precisely like what you're saying, that like in order to build the one state solution, which in effect there is a one state solution, but there is only a very small, very privileged amount of people for whom like that benefits, and the people who benefit least off of it, so to speak, are actually for whom it's detrimental is the Palestinians. Because they're kind of in this archipelago of cities that have like for example, like I don't know if you ever went over. I can't remember right now off the top of my head, but if you ever went over when Destiny and others went to Israel and then they crossed the Green Line into the West Bank. But he did a debate with Yishai Fleischer, who's like a huge propagandist, an actual war criminal, etc. Twice over. Is like he was talking about the sterile zone, and I'm like just thinking about that phrase, like yes, we had to create a Palestine-free sterile zone, so that way like you don't have to interact with them, right? And it's just this very strange thing where like there are charitable organizations that you can pay, including into Yishai Fleischer's little org that he has, which is why I was very adamant to say that like Destiny giving him airtime, Destiny giving him attention, right? Who knows, maybe even money, like for the tour around Al-Khalil, right, could count in some cases as aiding and abetting. I'm not saying for sure that is what that is, but I'm saying there are people for whom it could definitely count.
Well, there are
because
two huge problems here. First of all, Destiny is a garden variety psychopath.
Well,
just to let's put it mildly, he is not the kind of person you want to bring home to mom, broadly speaking. Secondly, here's the first problem. If we look at Israel, by and large, what do? They have a whole bunch of systems that effectively terrorize the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. And then what happens is once those civilians get done terrorizing them, they run to the skirts of the IDF, occupying forces, and the IDF protects them. Basically, Israel has become a state sponsor of terrorism in all but official designation.
Oh, yeah.
The problem with citing Destiny's particular case is that he's not going to be tried in international court. If anything, he would be tried in a federal court, where we do not recognize that Israel is a state sponsor of terrorism and that what they're doing is terrorism. Like you had Clinton in the 90s specifically citing the fact that, the West Bank settlers can't be doing terrorism because bulldozers aren't equivalent to bombs. Aren't they? Both of them are knocking down houses. Like, come on now, dude. So, like, all of these things, the system is like, we carve out these special exceptions, rhetorical exceptions for Israel, really, when you get down to it, because they're not practical exceptions. We carve out these rhetorical exceptions all the time for Israel. And then if you even push back a little bit, then Israel does, I'm just a small boy, you can't hurt me, type shit. Which drives me absolutely batty, to be frank. But, like, there is not really a honest discussion that is happening in the that's not true. I want to be fair to some of the people I've talked to. Among military historians and military officers, there's a very low-level discussion going fuck, Israel's screwed. But there is, for the political class, no honest discussion happening about Israel. That is a precursor to any kind of real solution coming out of this. Is basically we have to start talking about this honestly, and we have to call a rake a rake.
Right, and see, like that's one of those things where, the fact that there is so much, collusion and so, all of these other things, right? I mean, like, I know people have different ways of expressing, right, what Israel is and its relationship vis-a-vis the United States, right? The United States, I should say. right, as it being, it's permanent aircraft carrier in the Middle East and all of these other things, right, and then with the UK, right, it was supposed to be, I guess its own aircraft carrier, so to speak, in relation to Suez, etc. But like the amount of and I've mentioned this book before, but I don't know if you've ever read it. It's called Border Optics: Surveillance Cultures on the U.S. Mexico Frontier. And the reason why I bring it up is because in Camilla Fojes's book, she's talking about something that Anthony Lowenstein later on like writes another book about that's more in depth. But essentially speaking, how a lot of the border surveillance and violence producing stuff that like the Border Patrol, DHS, IMS, etc., right, is first tested on the Palestinians, right? So like the United States also invests in Israel because it essentially has a trapped population on whom to test it on human subjects, right? And so there are many aspects of that too, right, where the fact that that the United States is always willing to veto any action that would harm the state of Israel, or even when it comes to an ICJ decision or ICC decision, right? Whether or not, right, Netanyahu would ever face any consequence of that is something that we will not be certain of, right? In fact, if anything, the chances are he's not going to be ever prosecuted, at least not in the ICC, right? But
Yeah.
definitely, I mean,
I think it's pretty unlikely that he gets prosecuted in Israel at this point. I have a sneaking suspicion that he's going to be successful at his redesign of the judiciary in that regard. There is, I think, a worthwhile point that you talk about is Israel is a bad ally to the United States. We gain nothing from them anymore, at all, strategically speaking. Just particularly when you counter and we can get anything that we might have got from Israel from other safer countries in the Middle East. They are an albatross around the Americans' necks policy-wise in the Middle East, and have been for some time. And it's worth noting, particularly if you look at the peace process as a larger whole. You have the 1978 Camp David Accords, where they negotiate the peace between Israel and Egypt. Jimmy Carter does, right? And this is really unique that Carter, for what it's worth, holds Israel's feet to the fire in returning territory to Egypt to get them to be induced to sign this treaty in the first place. And it turns out that this has been fairly successful. Same can be said of Jordan. And Jordan's even a more unique case because they return territory as well, but they lease out territory from Jordan that they want to continue to operate on. Now you turn around in the late 90s and you get to Syria, and they try to pull shenanigans about the Golan Heights, and Syria rejects the plan outright because they didn't get the same deal that Egypt and Jordan gets. There is a degree, there was a period of time, and it kind of switched around Reagan, and Ronald Reagan is where most bad things in our recent history emerge in the United States, right? There's this period of time where we kind of start, playing second fiddle to Israeli policies in the Reagan administration, and this continues onward for some time afterwards. That makes all of everything we've tried to do with Israel much less successful since then. So there's a case to be made that the United States is more effective, would be much more effective if they had a tighter rein on Israel. It's much more a tail wagging the dog situation now than it ever has been. That's largely why I have a hard time with this. I've been having a hard time with this Camp David video essay because when you read American accounts of what happened, it just seems delusional. Like there were like 4 people who knew what was happening, and one of them was not Madeleine Albright, right? Like there's very small amount of people who were in the know on Camp David, and they just screwed the pooch to high heaven.
And not only that, but but alongside like Camp David and then Oslo and 2000 and everything, is that it's always on the side of like, why aren't the Palestinians willing to be the first, like the willing to be willing to give everything up or like back down, right? When it's so clear that one, the United States and Israel, because it's backed by the United States, have nothing to lose, right? Whereas Palestine, if it drops its guard, so to speak, will lose everything, right? And that's why, like when people bring up, oh, there was a chance where they could have, like when people do that thing, oh, there were this many times that they were offered peace, blah blah blah, right? Like at Camp David, pardon me, not at Camp David, I should say, at Oslo, and then Madrid and everything, is that one of those things is that it's always making it seem as though the Palestinians writ large, or even embodied in the PLO, somehow had an equal seat at the table with the state of Israel and the United States, right?
Well, that's the mechanical part of it that I find interesting, like to talk about, because we talk about the Palestinians, right? And this is not useful in a certain sense. There is not a unified political movement in Palestine, and there never has been. And that's what's allowed Israel to do what they've done. So, like, going back to Madrid is a perfect example. The PLO has observer status at Madrid. They are cast off to the side. Yasser Arafat, broadly speaking, is distrusted by Israel and the United States. They bring in what they presume are moderate Palestinians to negotiate about this. And the Israelis, and by extension the United States, find the Palestinians' position unacceptable. They're like, well, we want you to stop building settlements at a bare minimum, and we want this, this, and this. And they're like, no, screw you. We're not going to talk to you anymore. We're going to take our toys and go home. A few years later, you get the Oslo Accords, which specifically elevate the PLO, who just a few years ago were terrorists who could not be negotiated with. Right? Elevates the PLO and forms a Palestinian Authority. And they make a bunch of demands of the Palestinian Authority, which they take on because they want the power, but they can't necessarily enforce, and that Israel isn't a partner in enforcing. And to make matters worse, it's not even just that. Like, that's the first premiership of Netanyahu coming up quick, right? And he specifically sabotages the Oslo Accords in order to develop his own new settlements. And then afterwards, the supposedly liberal Barak does the same thing. So we don't talk about these things properly with the amount of nuance they need. And we kind of, again, present this as a case of, oh, the Palestinians are unreasonable. When the reality is that Israel doesn't seem that interested in peace. They seem invested, even though not everyone talks about it, in this concept of Greater Israel. Like, you've seen the maps, I'm sure, of Israeli accounts still going, we should reoccupy the Sinai, which won't go well for them because Egypt has been preparing for that for 50 years now. But still. And then there's the question of, like, from the river to the sea, and Likud's declaration doesn't necessarily mean the Jordan River. Sometimes they're talking about the fucking Euphrates. So this concept of Greater Israel is very much alive and well on the Israeli right, and any challenge to that they see as unacceptable. So really, like, people have talked about the fact that, oh, Netanyahu must go. I'm like, no, you basically need to get rid of 90%, 99% of the whole Knesset before you have a reasonable party to talk to. And you have to give the Palestinians this opportunity to form these institutions that can even take over a state in the first place. And that's not happening. And every time it does, you get the moderate Palestinians co-opted by the PLO. Israel allows the PLO to co-opt them. And then Israel allows Hamas to co-opt the Palestinian Authority. And they can play this game for as long as they stay alive, basically, without really being challenged on it, unless somebody sticks their foot up their ass. And it's going to have to be us, to be frank. And I think we might be a decade or two away from that. The question is, do we have enough time, or the situation collapses? And I don't know if we do.
No, I definitely see what you mean about like there is there are definitely, especially because of October 7th and everything that's happened since then, right? That was never anticipated, was never, I mean, so to speak, like had it been like in 2014 or 2012 or in 2008, where you had, you know, the mowing of the grass, right? That you had in Gaza, it was different, right? It was, yes, there were all, you know, war crimes, et cetera, et cetera. Yes. Um, but now that you have the wholesale destruction of the entire Gaza Strip to the point where like all of the groundwater, even the aquifer below, is all contaminated. You know, you have polio now. You have, you know, let alone all the other contractable viruses and diseases that people are having problems with. But another thing too is that yes, like with Halikud, right, which is what you get when with Menachem Begin, right, is that that's when you begin to get people, well, with Netanyahu in particular, right, like it should not be forgotten that just before just before Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in what is now called Rabin Square, but back then was just part of Mayor Park. It was Netanyahu that said that, you know, was essentially calling for violence against him, and he's
Yes.
never faced any consequences about that. And so the fact that it was a, you know, a fundamentalist Israeli, you know, essentially Zionist.
He was a college student, if I recall, like a very young man who assassinated.
Yeah, because I always have to try to not confuse him with Baruch Goldstein, because that's actually that's something I was going to bring up in relation to the Destiny thing, because like Yishai, he chose to show that in the background for a reason. Like, you do not show the site of like the most horrendous settler massacre of Palestinians in your background, right? Like in that way, just for nothing, right? Like it's not just a pure accident. Like, he chose a studio with you know, ground with ceiling to floor windows just facing the Ali Brahimi Mosque, right?
Yeah.
And then went on to like deny the suffering of the Palestinians, right? So but the point being that yes, that like Netanyahu was saying things like that were active calls to violence, then it was taken upon someone to do that violence, and then you know, even now, right, like you have many people, and I've heard this from people like, but even back when I was still Hasidic, like sometimes I would hang around people that weren't necessarily Hasidic, but they were still like modern Orthodox is what they would say here in America. But them saying that like, oh, Netanyahu, like, you know, with all of his faults, he's the only person capable of leading the state of Israel. And I always felt that that's like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Isn't the whole point that it's a democracy, blah, 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 you know, but it's not, right? Like, it's like, he's the person that can complete the task that Ben Gurion couldn't. Right. That's in essence what they are saying. You know, and so that is one of those things too, that like another thing, just a quick thing I want to add here, and then I'll pass it off to you, is the fact that Israel has also changed, at least in one sense, in that it expelled Meir Kahane. I think it was in 83. It might be it might be later.
I think that's 83 or 84.
Right, but now you have Bezalel Smotrich, who and Itamar Ben Gvir, who they are the, like, particularly Smotrich is known for speaking with this organization that he forms some part of. I forget, like, if he's the chairman or something, but like it's the one that does the Greater Israel map that shows like Jordan, all of historical Palestine, etc. Right. He like they are very much Kahanes, just they have not been removed from the parliament, right? So it's like Kahanism has now become even more radicalized and now been given the levers of power that even Mayor Kahane never had, right? Like he was never the minister of finance or the minister of public safety, like,
That one's a
Bezalel
big one,
and
actually. I've noticed reports coming out of Israel of increasingly dangerous police repression against Israelis who speak out against the regime. That's, I think, the truth of Israel that people don't get, is that they're not a democracy anymore. They are. They have taken a page from Putin's Russia and how they've structured themselves in a very real way. And like, it's hard for me not to make these comparisons too, particularly with all the stuff we've done on Ukraine in the last 2 years, and all the stuff we've now been working on in Israel. It's hard for me not to see the parallels. They've essentially become a one-party state, like democracy in name only. You see all these stories about Likud ministers engaging in corruption in such a way as to neuter political opposition. And then you see these people like Gavir and whatnot, and all these particularly radical ministers that Netanyahu entered into an alliance with. And we pretend there's a huge distinction between Likud and them, and there not really isn't. They're just much more willing to engage in that kind of violence on behalf of what is basically a very large Israeli right-wing coalition. To the point that like we've kind of Netanyahu has been a figure, and a majorly distrusted figure, as far as most Americans are concerned, in Israeli politics for some time, except for Trump, who decided to screw us over even more efficiently there too. But like you mentioned, the Golan Heights and the recognizing of the capital as Jerusalem was a kick in the teeth. The problem,
as well as the Abraham Accords as well. So
yeah, the problem that we run into again and again and again is the Palestinians don't have anyone on their side. It's a simple fact. If tomorrow the United States decided to stop vetoing things in the UN, Russia would pick it up, because the Soviet Union has long been a friend to Israel too, and they would love an opportunity to divide the United States and Israel. All of these things are a problem for Palestine. But the thing about the Palestinians is they just haven't laid down and died the way the Israelis hoped they would. And they aren't going to. So we face the prospect of like an endless fight, which works for the Israeli right, because they need an enemy so that no one notices how much they're screwing over their own population, right? But it doesn't really work for people who want to see this resolved. And like it becomes exponentially dangerous because Israel keeps trying to drag us into a war. Like, consider all the stuff that's happened in the last 2 days. The pagers exploding and the radios exploding. Why did they do this now? And I think the answer is because if they did this now while the United States naval presence is still in the region, they can supplement their defenses with our own. Because their defenses wouldn't last long against Hezbollah flinging a couple thousand rockets again. But we can shoot those down pretty well. So
right, and
so why did this happen now? It doesn't really seem to have a military objective. It just seemed to be because they could.
Right, and the one thing I was mentioning is like the fact that now they've also attacked people who were in the, again, like same thing with what happened with the chief diplomat of the political wing of Hamas, not Yahya Sinwar, who is of the militant wing, right? Because Israel loves to portray it as though there is no difference between any of them, but there was a substantial difference. One being that over here you have the person who was killed in Tehran never participated in any militant activities ever in his life. Was part of the political wing and lived in Qatar and etc. Right. But another thing too is that you have that with Hezbollah, where they do have a political wing, that runs in the Lebanese parliamentary elections, which are still sectarian, which is why Israel in particular has had an outsized role in playing divide and conquer, right, in Lebanon, because of the sectarianness constitution that they have. So one aspect of that is that one of the MP's son was killed via one of the pager detonations. And it's like, now you have someone who does have state power, right? Someone who does sit in the halls of power. That's not a militant that you can, brush aside. Now you have someone in the parliament. I don't even know if there are others who have also, but now you have given someone, and again, this might, maybe I'm not framing it in quite the way I probably could, but it's like, I wouldn't run it past him for him to try to avenge his son in some way using the state apparatus now, because he's already in the state apparatus, being a legislator, but also now you have a direct attack upon even people who by definition would be civilians, right? So
there is a problem that Israel has, and they're not good at this, broadly speaking, throughout their military history, of recognizing the distinction between civilian, combatant, and combatant. They're bad at it. I'll be frank. Let's just be right at the top. The IDF is not nearly as good as some people portray them as. They are pretty shit these days as a military force. They're not effective. And like the Plus 972 magazine articles have been fantastic in highlighting those problems and their unwillingness to even give a crap about the laws of war that they're supposed to. So the principal issue, I think, is twofold. They're perfectly happy to target people en masse. It works for them because they don't expect the consequences to come back on them. And being fair, the only country that's really positioned to do anything about it is Egypt. Syria is still engulfed in their civil war, and Iraq is, largely due to us, also engulfed in in a large amount of sectarian violence. So they feel pretty secure at the moment, I think, in reality, from attack. Israel constantly makes this argument of being exposed to, well, if we let our guard down even a minute, they will come and kill us, which isn't really borne out by the history of the conflict.
No.
At all. Like it's particularly silly when you get into 48 and 49 and all that, but that's beside the point. They are in a position right now where they're like, and we don't know all the details yet, but at least a few children were listed among the dead of yesterday. And like people are trying to make this argument that Israel did some kind of precision attack on Hezbollah. And it's not the case. Like I can't make that argument, like from a substantive point of view, because you don't know who's holding 4,000 pagers, my dudes. You just don't. Where they are when you blow them up. And now that there's more stuff happening, radios and solar panels, apparently. That's, well, maybe not the solar panels. I don't think too many people hang out on their roofs. But, like, they're doing it because they can, not because it's fulfilling a concrete military objective. And that, in and of itself, even if they hit, like, let's suppose out of those 4,000 yesterday, they hit 3,500 terrorists and only 500 civilians. If you don't have a concrete military objective, that strike still isn't legal.
Yeah.
There's got to be something on the other side of it. Okay, I've invested these resources. Where do I sit after I succeed at these objectives? Is one of those vital military things that Israel doesn't do. So, like, it's hard to make an argument that they're justified in these actions.
And we do know that historically speaking, they have done the thing of, actually, this battalion or whatever, they did X thing that we didn't know about, but we're going to give it post hoc clearance, right? Like that is something that even going back to 47, 48, 49 is something that they are wont to do. So yeah, for like
Yeah.
that is something that that the IDF has done, and again, that's the reason why it takes credit for things, even when they technically were never even planning to do XYZ thing either. And not only that, but like what you were saying, like about the solar panels. Again, we have to like even contextualizing what's happened in Lebanon since, right, the huge explosion in the port of Beirut, right, which decimated like a whole portion of the main part of the city, right, of its
A
downtown
lot of
area.
habitat, like a lot of like residential areas, if I recall.
Right. And so like someone with solar panels, which are not, I mean, they are not cheap. I'll put it like that. They are not inexpensive, right? They are something that if someone has, it's because they, right, it's usually in many cases because like I've been to the Middle East, I've been to Syria, and I've been to Jordan. And like people that did tend to have things like that were people who, for example, were could not connect to the grid in any meaningful way, or because the grid just does not work. And that is something that is true in Lebanon, right? Because essentially, they've had hyperinflation, they've had, all of these things stacking up against them since that explosion, but even prior to that. And now you have something like this where even people trying to use something to deal with the fact that electricity isn't on 24/7. um Now even those things, right, can be detonated at the whim of who knows, right? Like we have no, I mean, there are no real objectives at all. And not only that, but like Netanyahu keeps changing them, right? Like now, oh, we are going to send people back to their homes. Which homes? Like so many of them are destroyed. Some of them were destroyed by the IDF itself. I mean that is another aspect too, is that like so many of the homes in Kibbutz Be'eri and Nahal Oz, etc. Right? Like all these places were destroyed from above, so we know it couldn't have been the people that came through the fence on October 7th. It's like, what home do they have to go back to, right? Like, it's more of a rhetorical thing, but it's all based on this idea that like by us attacking Lebanon, particularly increasingly deeper into the country, somehow that's going to make people return back to their homes. And it's like that doesn't go that doesn't make any sense, even tactically, because like all what you're doing now um, is giving more incentive, if anything, for Hezbollah to begin doing more strikes. Because now you're angering more parts of the country that are not like controlled by Hezbollah, which is typically restricted to the southern part of Lebanon. So and I know I shared this earlier today, but like even the what's his name, Ariel Yalon, had announced that the IDF is at top or at the highest readiness, right, for an incursion or for action, I think is how he worded it, right, in Lebanon. And I'm thinking, you're over here moving, battalions and stuff from Gaza, right, and from the Gaza envelope over to northern Israel. Like, what do you think you're doing? You know what I mean? It's like, that is not like Gaza is a completely isolated, right, imprisoned population. Lebanon is not, right. And in fact, if I can just add one last quick thing before I pass it on to you, is the fact that I actually found this out when I was researching for. I wanted to do a kind of like, for the last article, I was thinking of doing a like, what's happened until now type of thing, just like a very quick summary article. But I found out that all of the insurance companies for traveling insurance, none of them will underwrite travel insurance for anyone going to the state of Israel. And I'm like, now that I've never seen before, right? Because that's something that has always been a thing, right? Because Lebanon is one thing, but when it's the state of Israel, then that says something else as well. So.
Well, I think that, not to belabor the comparison, but we watched last winter and this winter Russia's targeting of Ukraine's power grid, right? And how many people said that was, out of bounds and horrible? And I haven't seen the same thing today about the targeting of these solar panels in Lebanon. And I think one of those things that you kind of get into, and like, I don't know how many of my streams you've watched with Commander McMillan. We've talked a little bit about the mechanics. Bad militaries have a very difficult time doing precision objectives. You see that with Israel's military, right, in Gaza. You see that with Russia, particularly early on the conflict. Bad militaries that are faced with competent near-peer opponents tend to get better. Russia's military has gotten much better over the course of the last 2 years. Israel's has not, because they have sat there and been an occupying force for a very long time. What happens when they go into Lebanon, which was brutal, a slugging match for them in 2006, and they encounter the same kind of resistance that they don't have the control over the way they do in Gaza? Like in Gaza, they've got everybody in a little box, which is really helpful, by the way, if you want to shoot at people, putting them in a box. That's not the case in Lebanon, like you pointed out. And now you have a population of Lebanon that over the last 2 days has learned they very much have to fear the Israeli military that's about to cross their border. They're not going to sit back and take that. They're going to fight, and people are going to die, and then Israel's going to claim they need to be ever more severe in order to do that. And like, no, there aren't politicians in the United States who are questioning this resolve. Like, just, what was it, yesterday? Somebody asked a Muslim American, do you support Hamas? Or do you condemn Hamas? Like, what the fuck, dude? Yes, we can reasonably assume that the person doesn't support Hamas. Why are you asking this question? And it's good political points, because there is very little in the United States. There's no equivalent to AIPAC for the Palestinians. And like, I know I'm going to get yelled at by Brianna Wu again. I'm okay with it though.
Again.
About bringing this up, but like, AIPAC isn't required to register as foreign agents, even though they're advancing a foreign country's cause. What kind of screwed up crap is this? I have a right to ask if that's a little fishy, just a little bit. It's one of those exceptions we carve out for Israel.
Right, and then there's another one that comes to mind too when it comes to arms shipments. Israel is the only country for which, if we give armaments to, we don't have to try to assess whether or not it could be used for potential like war crimes, etc. That's something that is only done after they have been given, and however long after is at the discretion of essentially of the Pentagon.
So I'm given to understand that the Department of Defense has opened an investigation about the arms shipments to Israel, whether or not they were used in war crimes, and that is just today. They've opened this investigation.
Well,
I also, to the credit of my friends in the DoD, I know that there has been pushback happening and a battle between state and DoD about all of this. The willingness of the American military apparatus to go along with and openly support Israel has never been high. And now but that's different than opposing it. Now there's going to be an argument and a discussion. And like, that's where, if the policy is going to change, it's going to change because we make the argument that it's not a defensible strategic policy. Because no one does foreign policy by whether or not it's moral or not. It's just not how it's done. So like the wheels are turning that I think that are going to change the situation.
Yes, and I think like I don't know if you were, I believe you were there when there was that call-in, right, of that person that was trying to be like, oh, we have to where they brought up Mladic and Milosevic and in the call-in, or the one call-in that went on yesterday, where essentially taking this view of oh, voting for Trump somehow would be a gain towards the left in the United States. Like, yeah, if they were like, if President Trump were to be elected and everything, and if all of the things that we know that he intends to do, and let alone all things we don't know, yeah, the amount of recourse that any of these things would have would diminish immensely. And that also even goes to the fact that you know, the investigations that are starting, right? It's like they take a long time, right? Like that's one thing I keep telling people about, like with the ICJ. It's like they're not going to come back with a verdict within like a year or so. It usually takes 4 to 5 years, thereabouts. And with the ICC, I mean, they haven't even been able to get the warrants issued, right, by the preliminary tribunal. So there's a lot, but now because Israel has been like in fact, its foreign ministry accidentally posted on Twitter a kind of like, oh, we find it to be
They started whining early, yes, about the arrest warrants.
Right, and so now it's like, well, now the ICJ, now the ICC has no reason not to, because they already know what the response is going to be. So there's a lot of that where it's like now all these investigations are being started, and so that also is part of kind of how it's progressed as well. So, but I do find that really interesting that now you do have a DoD investigation into that. I did have a chatter that had a question, and I'm not. And again, if you know, if you would like to elaborate on it, I would be curious to know as well. And they asked, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much, DJ. Thank you so much for the raid. I appreciate it. Welcome in, streamer. Welcome in, raiders. I'm Shakespeare, culture historian. We're currently talking about Palestine with Two Guys Talk History, particularly Daedalus. The chatter said, I'm curious what is about Israel's genocidal tactics. What influences or tactics has Israel adopted from other nations or global military practices throughout its history?
Okay, that's a
It's a very big question.
Yes, and it's a long question, and it changes depending on when we're talking, right? So, like, to be not helpful, but 47, when you start to see the upkick in violence as it starts to move away from British occupying forces onto the general Palestinian population, you see a very kind of like a classic death squad approach to a lot of these groups, Haganah and Irgun engaging in. They go into a village and they massacre the people in the village, which invites retaliation from the less well-organized armed Palestinian groups, and onward and onward. And that's kind of how they start. They kind of get their start being that classic thuggish Rwandan style, I'm going to roam through your village and kill you type shit. And those are the organizations that by and large become the IDF throughout the course of the 1948 war. And they just grow and they get better at killing people, basically. And that's kind of where it starts. And that's kind of the impetus of the Nakba. And then they take all this territory because the Arab League isn't terribly invested in the war. So that's kind of where it starts. And it changes over time. Like military tactics wise, they build a very effective army for a good 2 decades there, through the 50s and the 60s, by and large by leeching off ideas from other countries, mostly the United States. The second thing that they develop, and they have gotten very good at, and while the quality of their army has declined, the quality of their Air Force is excellent, because they keep buying upgrade packages from us for planes, and they've also bought the F-35, which has made them expensive but superlatively well done. So you have this particular bit where it's not like they've developed a particular set of strategies. They kind of have stuck with a fairly traditional set of like occupation strategies.
Mm-hmm.
If you want, to do a very specific chatter thing, you can just go look at Benny Morris talk about what villages were destroyed by Irgun and Haganah. He's an Israeli historian, so I don't think you'd have a particular problem with the bias there.
The only, the only other, for that chapter, I would also say, like the ethnic cleansing of Palestine also goes very in detail into specific villages as well, and also goes very into, um, particularly, and I found this one to be so fascinating, was in Jaffa, the fact that there were second generation Templars that joined in the pro-Palestinian fight against the occupying Haganah forces, which I'm just like, it's not something you think of, like Templars and the and the Haganah. It's just like one of those things. But yeah,
turning into an Assassin's Creed game at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
God damn it. Yeah, we just have a chatter who's not particularly enthused with people saying bad things about Israel. No, it's not really debatable. Like the villages are gone. Well, it's not a point of contention amongst anyone but Israeli propagandists. It's just not.
I mean, even in the IDF archives, even at the stuff that even the public could access, like at the National Library of Israel, there are like multiple texts. I mean, I know that some of them Ilan Pape cites, but literally, like until you have the new historians, right, in the 80s, even the kind of more pro-Israeli sort of the myth and legends of the founding of the state of Israel, even they say that certain places were destroyed because of the fact that it kind of has to be acknowledged, like the Yassin or other places. So yeah.
Well, it's worth pointing out that by and large, Israel is, particularly when the partition plan comes out, and why the partition plan wasn't accepted, I imagine, is because you just turned over and gave 5% of the local population at the time of the partition 55% of the territory. No matter how this played out, you would have seen mass displacement of Palestinians. Had they accepted the partition plan, they would have had, by and large, some of the same effects as had they not. So there's no real impetus for the Palestinians to accept the partition plan, right, at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it turns into a very one-sided discussion when you get into that. Like, oh, why didn't the Palestinians just accept the plan? Like, why? Who would do that? And that's not even taking the superficial problems with the partition plan. Like, oh, there's a whole bunch of non-contiguous territory that you now have to administer and govern without a government. That'll be easy to do.
Right. And also the fact that who gave anybody, let alone the British or the United Nations, the right to partition said land in the first place? That's always one of those things where people kind of don't consider that question. Like, well, the Palestinians, it's not as though they were the ones who said, oh, we're willing to partition the land. No, it was imposed upon them from the outside. So that's one of the foundational questions that also needs to be thought about, and which historians have focused on is the fact that like even Benny Morris, and again even the biographer, I can't remember his name right now, of Ben Gurion, even he talks about that, because Ben Gurion, he says, he writes it in a very passive voice, but essentially that Ben Gurion and the Jewish Agency for Israel Representation, or for Palestine back then, but the Zionist organization, the World Zionist Organization representatives present at the UN, that they accepted the partition plan cynically, quote unquote, because they already knew that they were never going to abide by the borders in the first place. That comes from Ben Gurion's diaries, right? Like this comes from their own writings, the founding fathers of Israel. So
yeah, I think that's probably like, on the one hand, I get that it is a foundational question. Going forward, though, I don't know if it's a question that's settleable, right?
oh yeah. I mean,
Like when we talk about the solution to the problem, there has to be a way. We have to eventually go and say, well, what's happened has happened. Now we need to figure out what we can do justly with what we have. And I think like Resolution 242 is probably the best place to start. You don't get to keep the West Bank. You don't get to keep Gaza. You don't get to keep the Golan Heights. Sorry, no can do. And let's work it from there.
wait, who's 91? Sorry, someone is saying that someone's 91. Oh, Chuck Grassley? Yeah. Anyway. Yes, like it's like, I mean, again, like that's why, like with historians, it's not about trying to provide some definitive answer. It's about trying to it's a hermeneutical process, or processes, as I would argue, when it comes to writing historiography, because it's not as though we're trying to have one version of the truth and then that's it, right? But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's a whole different point. But yes, when it comes to, though, it's I had mentioned this before, and this is my answer to that chatter's question, is that my chatter's question is that we do know that one of the tactics that influenced the Dahia doctrine, which began by Eisenkot, who is also still in a military position now in Gaza, even though his son and his nephew have passed away in combat, was influenced, interestingly enough, by Mussolini's southern campaign during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, which is the idea of like power targets. But that's the only other that's all I know. I only know of this influence because of the fact that there was the discussion of like previous times that the usage of power targets was useful for the the collapse of sort of untrained militias, right, which is what the Italians are trying to do in southern Ethiopia. So anyway, that's my
I think that's another good example of a campaign where a bad military has to adapt on the fly, and they do it in a brutal fashion. Ethiopia, generally, the Italian campaign. They weren't prepared for the war they started, and they got their asses kicked for a while.
Yeah.
To the point that it's the only country in Africa that has remained uncolonized. Like Ethiopia was very well prepared for and like the brutality that the Italians eventually turned to end that war is certainly an example, but like it's not the only example. So you saw the same thing happen by the Germans and Italians when they aided the nationalist Spanish in the Spanish Civil War. The infancy of air combat created a very different kind of set of incentives, and we saw a lot of brutality in that period being basically done by bombers, which is something that Israel has picked up to this day, but they're not the only ones who've done that. So like, and it's a discussion we kind of had before. When you have these fighters, it's not necessary to do it this way. Fighter jets can very precisely, with their onboard computers, place bombs on targets. So like, it's a choice that they're making at that point.
Mm-hmm.
It's always nice. It's always nice when the people, when the propagandists hit my stream. Good fun. Hate views are still views. So thank you much.
So one other aspect that I sort of thought that we could discuss would be um, sort of like and again, we can approach this however you would like. Well, actually, you know what? I wanted to also ask you, were there any topics or any questions that you sort of had that you wanted to discuss?
Well, I didn't have a plan for this today because I'm bad at my job. I was, I mean, the stuff I've been focusing primarily on has been the nuances around the Camp David negotiations in 2000, right?
All right.
And like that's an ongoing process. And like what'll happen is, and this is more an impression, I'll pick up my reading material. I've got a huge set of stuff I've found. I'll pick up my reading material and I'll start reading this, and then I just get pissed at it because it's just so outrageously like cynical the way it went down. I guess what insights you have around that process, that particular period, would be kind of like where I'd want to focus around that particular time, that Oslo Accords into the Camp David process.
Right. Well, I mean, like for me, like then that sort of opens the discussion to looking at how you know um, you have the PLO being in Lebanon, right, and then that becoming a big issue, right, with in '82. So that's sort of like the lead up to because Camp David is '79, if I'm correct, right? Because that's with Jimmy Carter, right?
The Jimmy Carter
am I correct?
Camp David Accords is '79.
Yeah, because that's with Egypt, and that's when they sent their peace deal. And so in the aftermath of that, you have Black September, where you have the Jordanians essentially kicking out the PLO from Amman, and they moved to Beirut. And then the civil war begins in '82, which you also involves the incursion of the Israelis, right? And then you have the collusion between the Maronite Christian Phalangist militias and the IDF, because if I may just give a very quick rundown, the contention between the Phalangist militias and the Palestinians was that the French had left Lebanon with a sectarian constitution that gave power based on a census that was taken in 1932, I believe, or something like that, and it gave the Christians a small majority of 51%. So in their parliament, for every 5 Muslim seats, there had to be 6 Christian seats. But because it was tied to this demographic aspect, they viewed the movement of Palestinian refugees into Lebanon as somehow tipping that balance, even though they're refugees and couldn't vote somehow.
Yes, well.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has parallels to the United States in some ways.
Well, it has parallels to the messaging of people, like particularly being pushed by Elon Musk right now, right? They're sending in immigrants to take over the voting rolls. Like what? They can't vote.
Right, exactly. And so what ends up happening in '82 is you have Israel making its incursion, eventually reaching Beirut and having control over East Beirut, which is where most of the Christian areas are, and then eventually committing alongside with they didn't commit it, I should say. They're the ones that facilitated the Sabra and Shatila massacres, which were committed by the Phalangist militias.
Well,
so this would have been Lebanese. Yeah.
Well, that's not entirely true, because the facilitation was kind of direct, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, oh yeah, it was direct.
We know that the IDF supported them by like firing illumination flares so they could see why they were killing people at night.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
And
I just didn't want to make it.
Yes, there is unconfirmed and kind of difficult to confirm reports that the individuals to be massacred were being pointed out by agents of Mossad. So whether or not that's true is difficult to say, but it would be hard to say like, oh, they just facilitated. Like Israel at the very least seems to be an active participant. Ariel Sharon personally
Yes.
oversaw that operation.
Right. And that's what I was going to add sort of like as a caveat, like, and what I mean by like, facilitated or acted as an active accomplice to was one holding, like not letting anybody leave Sabra or Shatila, right? Because they surrounded it with IDF soldiers.
Yes.
They're the ones that only let in, they're the ones that let in the phalangists, told them, where some of the streets kind of, so that way they wouldn't get trapped or whatever, etc. Because they had already mapped it all out prior. And again, you also had the silencing of the radios as well, like So, and again, you also had the fact that the border itself between Lebanon and Israel was being kept open by way of their collusion with the Phalangist militias, because part of the border was there were Christian villages. Now they are no longer there.
Yeah,
but
they're gone.
because of what happened in 2006 particular. But but because of that, the phalangists used that little foothold they had down there in the south to control a certain part of the border that would allow the IDF to move more and more trucks in and everything. And so because of that, again, you do have that active collusion and that active, being an active accomplice to what some people have argued, and I found quite compelling arguments, but I'm still not. I still don't know quite. I would have to read a lot more because it's again it's not within my current scope of knowledge, so to speak. That have tried to argue that it should be considered a genocide, it vis-a-vis or in the same sense as like Srebrenica, but that's neither here nor there. That's a whole different conversation. But yes, they were active accomplices in that, by shutting down the radios, doing the flares, closing off and again, these were refugee camps, right? It's not like, the Palestinians had neighborhoods that they could have left. No, they were fenced, walled in. So that's another aspect too. So yeah,
I don't remember off the top of my head which was what, but one is a refugee camp and one is a local neighborhood where there was ostensibly Lebanese citizens living. So it was a twofold. They attacked the Palestinians there because, as far as the PLO is claimed, and whether or not this is true is again up to some debate, they evacuated PLO forces from the area as part of the deal, as part of the deal in the first place. So basically, it was very much designed to maintain a phalangist majority power on the power in Lebanon.
Right.
So
right.
I think is in particular something that has bothered me because we don't talk about it enough. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with Ryan Macbeth, the YouTuber.
I don't believe so. It's not ringing a bell off the top of my head.
He does, quote unquote, anti-misinformation YouTube stuff. And like he kind of came to prominence when Ukraine was invaded. And then when this October 7th happened, he started doing stuff on Israel, which has been shit.
Oh my gosh.
It's like, he did a short where he said, yeah, these people that these Palestinians in Gaza that got exploded by a pair of missiles had to be terrorists because Israel targeted them. Like, what? What are you smoking? Oh, you're still alive. Yeah. No, it's been, his stuff has been bad for Israel. Like, it's been relatively okay for Ukraine because he's compelled to find the answers when it comes to Russia. He feels not that compelled to find the answers when it comes to Israel. But he tried to make the circular argument that these terrorists must be terrorists because Israel targeted them. Like, wait, let's set aside Israel's long history of killing civilians and just look at that statement from a space of pure logic, shall we? And then nope. I'm like, I can't. But he continues to try to make these arguments about Israel is like, oh, they're the most moral army on earth, and other people have too. But he's been one of the more prominent YouTubers to do it. And like, no. So, did he? I've stopped watching most of his stuff. Everyone does ethnic cleansing. I have not done an ethnic cleansing, and apparently, according to Ryan Macbeth, I'm allowed. So, that'll be next year's big channel project, everyone. No, it won't.
What's I mean, like, one thing that I think is that is interesting about the sort of the people who are sort of trying to, like, one thing is when they try to act as though they're being neutral. It's one thing that I'm just like, if you're going to be pro-Israel, just be pro-Israel, right? It's just like, just instead of acting as though you are like, oh, both sides, right? Because it's very obvious that you don't really care about the Palestinians, right? And but they still want to give this air of supposed objectivity, quote unquote. Is that there are people for whom they always want to invoke literally everything that, like, the Israelis and the Hezbollah bring up every single time, right? They invoke, oh well, they bring up, oh well, they're afraid that another Holocaust is going to happen, and blah blah blah, and it's just like, what are you even saying? You know what I mean? And it's just like the strangest arguments to try to just end any discussion of the suffering of the Palestinians. It's like like the IDF, if it were to stop fighting today, all those people could go back to their homes. The Palestinians in Gaza have nothing to go back to. There is a material difference between the two sides, and that's why it isn't a war, right? As much as people want to try to call it one, right? In fact, that's another question. Like, what do you think about the fact that people are trying to make it seem as though, like, oh, it's a war, right? Because it's very strange to me to call it, the Israel-Hamas war, which is like, again, like when I read Haaretz, that's how it's like, oh, it's day 359 or whatever. I believe that's the day we're at so far. But it's just, to me, it's just like, it's not a war. Like, if you can control the water access, the food, and in fact, Israel is known, has been shown, there were reports that did this. Unfortunately, first they were only in Hebrew. Only recently that I see them appear in English. So now but at first it was only done in Hebrew. That any Arab Israelis who sent food donations, so for going back as far as they could have been donating, right? Because they're held under suspicion and were held under under a military government regime until 1965. The ones that are in the borders of, quote unquote, like, mainland Israel, are the ones that are given Israeli citizenship. Their food was allowed to just sit out in the heat to rot. They would not allow it to even be sent into Gaza. So all of that money and all of that stuff that they sent was never even considered to pass through the border. And so many people didn't know that, and they kept donating and donating and donating, thinking, I want to help, my fellow human. But then it turns out that this whole time they were literally just separating the boxes. If they were from other countries or from Jewish Israelis, they would allow them in. But if they were from Arab Israelis, they literally let them just rot on the side of the road. So there are aspects of that just make me, beyond hesitant, but just that make me adamant in my inability to call it a war as such, right?
So, whether or not the sides are evenly matched, I think, isn't necessarily what makes a war or not. I think you're absolutely right. There was a period of time where Israel effectively besieges Gaza. Um, functionally, right? They don't let supplies in, or they use Byzantine rules to keep supplies out. Has been another thing they've done. You're sending into, it's like the TSA. Oh, you have toothpaste. Type crap. Um, that they've done that, and they've used that to kind of justify slowing supplies down. The best estimates I've seen so far has been that this explicit starvation strategy has been abandoned. But they took these donations and they left them off to the side, or they did not do sufficient enforcement actions when civilians came and attacked those donations. So we run into a particular case. Hamas is fighting and they're hurting Israel, and to a certain extent. Are they doing it effectively? Probably not. But to be perfectly honest, Israel can absorb those losses. But like the broader topic I think I'd want to bring up is the flaw in the assumption of Israel, the core fundamental assumption of Israel, which is we need a Jewish state to protect Jews because no one else will. This is like, there's a huge problem I can see. First, the hypothetical problem. Let's say, hypothetically, Nick Fuentes becomes president of the United States.
Okay.
Let's just say that. And Nick Fuentes, who is not a friend to Jewish people, to be frank, or even not, like that's even putting it mildly, he's a horrible person, and particularly horrible to Jewish people, becomes president of the United States, and he goes, ooh, look at all these nuclear weapons. Let's go nuke Israel with its 9 million people, 9 million Jewish person population. That's the vast majority of the Jews in the world wiped out in one stroke. What could Israel do to stop that? Nothing. A fundamental assumption of ethnostates is wrong. We work best, and this is not, we work best as people when we join together and we acknowledge each other's differences and we work through those things. We are hardly perfect here in the United States, but there's something to be said for the idea of reaching for a culture where people can live side by side with different faiths and different ethnicities, and to try to reach for that. And that's the kind of goal I like to push. But there's something to be said for that, because it's a lot safer in the long run for everyone than trying to build our own little enclaves. Do you disagree?
Oh no, I completely agree. In fact, like I always give the examples that like the times when the Jewish people had, you know, the sort of these like, I don't like to call them golden ages, right? I know personally, just I don't like talking about them in that way, but like when they've been able to, you know, been able to be most open and most free in the ways in which they express their Judaism, et cetera, right? Were in times when there was, the tolerance and acceptance, right? Two separate concepts, but very important, both of them, of other peoples, right? And in fact, because I'm Sephardic, right? One of the places that come to mind for me are like Istanbul, Sarajevo, like places that are known for their large, intermixed populations. But even a place like Mexico City, where you have lots of indigenous people, Afro-Mexicans, you have, people from different parts of Europe, people from different parts of Asia, et cetera, right, all coming to this one place. The Jewish community there is, it's never had, say, well, let me put it this way. Why would the Jewish people who have suffered perhaps in one of, if not the most horrific ways, because of the idea of the nation state and then the ethno state, right? Why on earth would we want to have one, right? Because I think that Herbert Samuels, who was the only Jewish person in the British cabinet during the signing of the Balfour Declaration, said, the issue is if you sign that and you say that that's going to be the homeland for the Jewish people, is that then that makes every Jewish person around the world an alien wherever he has made his home, right? Like he's an Englishman, but now there's this, oh, well, you have this homeland, right?
Yes.
And I actually saw this where in Mexico, because Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, who is Mexican and Jewish, because of the fact that she's Jewish, um, one of the former presidents of Mexico, who is kind of Elon Musk like. I mean, not exactly in the same way, but kind of like in what he tweets, like kept bringing up the fact that, oh, she's not really Mexican. And this had never really happened before in history, where she was like, he was saying stuff like, well, she's a Bulgarian Jew. And it's just like, what, like, why, and then like, talking about, all of this other stuff, but it's this really weird anti-Semitism that kind of had never really existed on that, like that before in Mexico. Again, not that anti-Semitism is not there, but like on that scale with that much amplification, right? So open, so virulent in that way, has never been common. And that's also because the community is very integrated with all the other, the rest of the rest of the country. And so anyway, my point being that, when you have these places that are multi-ethnic, tolerant, accepting places, you always find that that is where the Jewish people have always found themselves having, the greatest contributions to Jewish culture, art, history, etc. Right? Like the Talmud Bavli. It wasn't, or the Babylonian Talmud, right? It already says it in its name, right? It wasn't produced in Palestine. It was produced in Babylon, where most Jewish people lived at the time, which was, where a multi-ethnic empire. Same thing with Kabbalah. Like it happened in medieval Spain when it was under Muslim rule and had, people from all different religions living together in Cordoba, etc. Right? Like in the entire peninsula. So, all of the evidence points towards, again, if we all accept one another and work together and live together, then that's when we actually get the, all of the things that people keep telling us are, outside of our reach in many cases. So
yeah, I think it's worth pointing out ultimately at the end of the day that Zionism kind of becomes anti-Semitic through how it interacts with basically the world at large. It accepts this concept of like this degradation, and then it says you will never be accepted here. And I this in some cases just not true. Like people make spaces for each other all the time, but Zionism argues that you will never be accepted, and then it encourages anti-Semitism in order to reinforce that point. There's no real like opposition to anti-Semitism for Zionism, because anti-Semitism drives and nurtures and makes Zionism stronger for people. And like you talk about that concept of divided loyalties that we talk about, like that's clearly not the case. Like there are so many people who just live and want to live their day as a Mexican, or an American. They are all so like one of the things I've noticed about my friends and acquaintances are Jewish. They love being Jewish, right? They love sharing things and doing all those things. So like it's not like there's not space for people to be themselves here. We should aspire to make that better and bigger and for more people. It's one of those things that a desire I hold quite dear is making things more multicultural. Kind of. Yes, Jim, you're absolutely right. Right now, one of the most dangerous places for the Jewish people is Israel, because that's why they keep leaving.
Yeah, very, very good point. And like to just add on to that just very quickly, if I may, like I also want to say something that kind of disproves this mythical, like, oh, it was meant to tolerate all the peoples that came upon its shores. the state of Israel is that like it banned Yiddish when it founded itself as a state. I mean, like the language spoken by the vast majority of the Jewish people at the time, they banned it, and so people that came out of the concentration camps that did try to find refuge there, that only spoke Yiddish, were literally like, you can't
Participate.
speak your own language. Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, Israel's been like, they're an ethno-state at the end of the day, and they build the structures of an ethno-state. So this revitalization of Hebrew, for example, is a great example of that. They need this language to kind of connect in this Reverend Christ way to the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, and the myth of the dual monarchy, right? They want to draw those ties and build those ties in a very specific way. And like my fundamental point would be, well, we've talked a lot about the suffering of the Palestinian people. I don't want the Palestinian people to suffer, but by the same token, I don't want the Israelis to suffer either. The desire for peace is really a desire for both people to live in peace. At the end of the day, because I think that's a fundamental right we have as human beings, is to ascribe towards peaceful existence with one another. And whether or not you agree with that, if you disagree, you're wrong. But the whole point, the whole point, the problem of Israel is that it does not provide for its people to live in peace.
Right. I mean, and we see this with people who are there for, like, for example, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, right, who is supposed to be in charge of public safety, is the person, handing out, AR-15s and who knows what else to random settlers who, you don't know, what they've done, or,
Actually, I suspect
et cetera, et
he
cetera.
has a very good idea of what they're going to do with those weapons. That's why he's giving them out.
Right, for sure, and he's handing it out, like it's it's kind of like the last rush of Halloween night. But one other thing too is the fact that, again, like, Israel has like what you're saying about living in peace, like, and this is something that comes from, again, my research of the different Palestinian and organizations and everything, is that like even with, like, when it came to, like, at the time when like Layla Khaled was kind of very important figure, and George Khazani and everything, is that the issue was never Jewish people living in Palestine. The issue was the settler colonial nature of the state of Israel, right? It was always like, oh, if Jewish people wanted to come here and this is where they found refuge, that's good about Palestine, right? Like, that says something good about us, right, collectively, so to speak. That being the Palestinians and Palestine, etc. But the issue was always that Zionism, right, stands in the way of that, because it tries to equate things like Jewishness and the state of Israel one-on-one, right? Especially like when you have this concept of like the Jewish state, like a state cannot be an ethno-religious concept, right? Like, it can't be that, right? What, like, especially with like the whole nation state law of 2018 or 2019, I should say, like, all of that stuff just stands in the way for people to live in peace, because it puts not only more barriers, but it also creates this the view that, like, Israelis, who, again, who, regardless of everything, again, it doesn't mean that they all should be expelled. It doesn't mean, like, none of those things should have even been on the minds of any of the organizations. It's always been allow us to return the Palestinian refugees to return to their land. And again, you kind of mentioned this with Resolution 242, and now with the ICJ as advisory opinion, right, which reinforces 242 in many ways, in that, let us return back to our homes, let us return, have access back to our lands, let us be co-equals in this land, right? And everything that is put in by the religious Zionist right and the secular Zionist right, I guess if you can even call it that, only does things that endanger the Israelis themselves, because it creates those separations that immiserate the Palestinians and cause them, and again it's I mean, even the special rapporteur, Francesca, I can't remember her surname, said that like they have the right to resist, and that's true. I mean, they do have the right of resistance against occupation. That is their right. And so anyway, to kind of finish my point. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, please go ahead.
Well, I think that's a really unique point to be made, is that when the opportunity has existed between the Arabs, they have tried and striven to accommodate peace. Egypt in 1978, Jordan again, like they went from Israel doesn't exist and we're going to blow them up to we can have peace. If the circumstances are created and people want to work for it, particularly Israel, I think it's possible for it to happen.
Oh yeah.
Given the choice between being a citizen of a country and being oppressed by Israel, the Palestinian will take the citizen of a combined one state for sure. They might not say it now, but they will, because it's better than the alternative. One of my chatters is asking, how do we avoid ethno-states? And like, that's a big question, to be sure. And it's a complicated one, I think, because ethnicity, we always forget that ethnicity is contingent upon experience and material condition. So there is, for example, you see it here in the United States, people like, they're Americans, but they also bring their culture and all that to that. The only real way to avoid that is to be open to and to be less hostile and resistant to new cultures and new identities. I don't become any less because, the neighbor who moved in next door is Mexican. That's basically the core of it. And that's a personal thing to begin with, but it's also how we build our laws and how we build our acceptance. And the United States has never been great at this. If you categorize our history through what we kind of go like, here's a wave of immigrants and we hate those people until they are not the next wave, and then we hate the new wave. And that the best way to avoid ethno-states is really to just continue to expose people to multiculturalism. And that's why the Israeli right is so incredibly resistant to the concept of a one-state solution, or integrating Arabs, or integrating Palestinians, or integrating Christians, is because it directly threatens that concept of a Jewish state.
Right. And like, that's the reason why, like for example, like I mentioned earlier with Yishai Fleischer, right? It's like only an ethno-state would require a sterile zone, right?
Yes.
So that way you don't even have to see, you know what I mean? Like the United States, for example, because of how it polices, particularly the U.S.-Mexico border, and again, this is also mentioned in Camille Fojas' book, but I've also spoken about it as well at length, that there is 100-mile from the border where essentially your 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights are not in, and a lot of people don't realize this, but it's usually because it's used very selectively, right? Based on ideas about race.
It strictly speaking exists on the Canadian border too. It's just not usually exercised there.
Right. And so like one of those things is that, it's like if you're driving on the 8 freeway, like down in San Diego, and like, I mean, there would have to be like an understanding that there would also have to be, for example, there are even issues where like the concept of like legality in the United States, right, has been kind of brought to the fore. Because there are some people saying, like, the fact that now in the United States, it's apparently okay to call for mass deportations, which is just unbelievable to me, because I'm just like, yeah, one of the solutions on the way to again, I don't mean to crudely make that comparison, but I'm just saying the fact that it is one of the things that falls under like the Genocide Convention, which is mass deportations. but the fact that they call it that is what I think sticks out to me is so striking. Is that is that it's all about seeing the culture as terminally or rather constantly a threat, right? And this is where a lot of so there's this really good book by Thomas Kuhn called Genocide and Belonging, and sort of discussing how like a lot of the myths and legends and stuff like that kind of held people together, that allowed for them to be complicit or silent or whatever it might be during the Holocaust in Germany, was built on things of like, oh, they're attacking things that are occurring now, like with Andrew Tate, et cetera, right, where they're saying, oh, they're attacking masculinity, they're attacking motherhood, blah, blah, blah. You have this same thing going on like in the United States, actually, where in the 1930s, you had a mass expulsion of Mexicans, whether or not they were citizens, right? So this idea of like, oh, if you come legally or if you're born here and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, now you have people saying, well, you can be born here, but blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no. Like you can't. And, there are people who, did sue and were able to get some reparations, so to speak, afterwards, some respite, but it was far too late, right? It was far too late, especially because the damage was done, in the 30s. But it was always based on this idea of, and I kid you not, literally, like if you read the book Decade of Betrayal, I mean, it talks about how it's literally based on the simple concept of they're taking our jobs, like that slogan even goes back to the Hoover administration with the mass expulsion of Mexicans. And so anyway, is that what you see is that even in small towns where you have lots of different peoples coming together, eventually they begin to build those networks of understanding and solidarity that they otherwise, right, if you were to, but the ethno-state model doesn't want, right? And like that's why one of the things that the Zionist propagandists, the Hasbarists, always have to do is always make the Jewish people elsewhere feel afraid. Yeah, victimized. So then that way, then that way you can donate money to the Jewish National Fund or to the Jewish Agency for Israel or make Aliyah, right? And it doesn't actually help you. It doesn't actually solve the problem that it supposedly was intended to solve, right? And so that is just one of those aspects that really sticks with me, because again, like the cities where even in Israel proper itself, right? The cities where that the tourism board promotes. It's Tel Aviv and Haifa, like literally mixed cities, as they call them in Israel, where you have Circassian people, you have Druze, you have Jewish people, you have Arabs, you have like all these different people, right? And that's what gives it its uniqueness. They never bring up, Nahariya, which is a town that's like almost 100% Jewish, Israeli, but there's nothing to do there. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing, because it's been ethnically cleansed. There's nothing there.
To
all of the history.
Yeah,
exactly.
I didn't want to cover much of it, but I did watch Destiny's coverage out of Israel because, he's blocked me on Twitter because I made fun of him for not knowing things because he hadn't got to it in Wikipedia yet. But he got treated horribly when he entered into a lot of, like, he got out of places like Tel Aviv and Haifa, and people thought, like, who the hell are you, and why are you here? And they were treating him like crap. It's just not a place you want to go. And like that's kind of like, I guess, the best answer. Like, what do we do? Where do we as citizens start? And that's being open to one another is the place to start, is ultimately, I think. Because here's the problem, particularly for the United States. This is a very conservative country. It will be that. The vast majority of the media apparatus is controlled or owned by conservative people. The discussion that happens around things, therefore, is framed in terms that conservatives want. particularly if you look at the discussion around immigration. A bustling trade with Mexico exists, and that trade includes labor. And the very act of closing our border has helped make the very problem that conservatives claim is the issue. So when you have a relatively open border, people come across here, they work, they go back. If they don't think they can come back and forth, then they're going to stay here where the money is that they can make working. So that's where a lot of these problems have come from. The best thing that we could possibly do is to have a European Union style economic zone with the United States, with Canada, with Mexico, with the Central American countries. That would alleviate these problems almost immensely and pull the rug out from a lot of the sicarios and the coyotes who try to get and smuggle things across the border. But they don't want to do that because it challenges this very racist concept of a Mexican invasion that is getting thrown around a lot again this year because it's an election year. Like Elon Musk has spent so much time, despite being an immigrant himself, trying to demonize immigrants.
I know it's
He's bought. Basically, he spent $40 billion in order to try to spread right wing white supremacy, and it's disappointing. I actually I know Twitter has always been a cesspool, but Twitter has always been great for keeping people out of bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
And Twitter used to be fantastic, and it's not anymore, but it used to be fantastic for finding that graduate student or that professor who was researching this really weird thing that no one talks about that you would suddenly get an insight on. And it's not that anymore. Now it's just a sea of inequities for Nazis. There's a lot of it. And the Republican Party has become a problem, obviously. They're basically talking about mass deportations. And because they keep the conversation there, that language infects the Democrats too, right? So a lot of this, one of the things that we have to start doing is pulling the Overton window back towards humanity again. And away from this, the Mexicans are coming to get us. I remember 2016, you had that guy, there'd be a taco truck on every corner if you vote for Hillary Clinton. Don't worry, I'm already sold. Now we have Taco Tuesdays? Fantastic. But it's always the scare tactics. And by and large, what we found is that people just get along if you leave them in one place long enough eventually. I lived in Chicago. I lived in Chicago for 10 years. And while they still have neighborhoods that are ethnically based, for the most part, most of those neighborhoods have kind of moved into multicultural neighborhoods. It happens over time, and it's violent sometimes, and it hurts, but eventually we get there. The question is, can we do it better and not necessarily let that fear be as pervasive as it is?
I have a chatter who's asking, my question would be if we have agency over this. I think information is just one color, and even people that have a lot of agency just change the shade due to the properties of the system.
I guess are they trying to argue that there is not sufficient information being given to the public? That's the question.
I guess, and the key of it, you're more than welcome to elaborate a bit more. But I think what he's trying to say is that how much agency do we have over sort of the idea of us over time? No, it's more if we can change the direction. Okay, so he responded, no, it's more if we can change the direction the information is going to.
Depends. I think there is a degree to which we've didn't do this properly as leftists. Like, don't talk about this the right way, and we kind of let institutions get away from us. Uh,
Mm.
it's it's a larger conversation in my mind. Is, do we have agency over this? Yes. Um, there's a reason why history departments are getting slapped down all over the country, and why they're being defunded. There's a reason why they don't want you to vote. There's a reason why there are parties that are making these messages that are designed to discourage participation, because agency exists and it's a threat to conservative ideals and values. The only place, and it's the place where the right wing has started to degrade these rights and values. The only place to do it is to start individually. The thing I always tell people is your first step is to see if you can run for office in your town. Sit on a city board, sit on a zoning board, sit on a school board. The discussion changes when the interlocutors change, and if we accept that that over here is the only place where the discussion can happen, then we've just ceded all the ground to them in the first place.
Right, like if there's nobody on with the people that have more institutional agency to do more, things that affect more people writ large, then uh, then there's nothing you can do, because then the most you can do is interpersonal, or if you have like a platform like we do, you can do it to some extent, but it's not the same as you affecting your community directly. And he responded, "You are right. Even in my country, starting budgets are now being cut down. Hopefully, there will still be space if I want to do my PhD." Yeah, I mean, like I just speaking to this really quickly. Like, I know departments. I'm not going to say where. I don't want to be specific, but that are even part of like the Cal State or the UC system, right? Where they don't give them money. Like, they have to make their own profits. It sounds strange for a public university, but like when you're telling a history department to make its own profits, that means you're telling it has to make corporate deals, right? Like, it needs to. That means you effectively told it, oh well, now for your like first year, second year students, you are only going to get you want to make a corporate deal with one publisher, right, to make those intro to history books or whatever they might be titled, right, from in a way, so then with contributions from people in your department, so then that way you get the department gets money added to its funds, right? And it's like, it seems ridiculous, but you'd be surprised how many departments do operate on that in that way, where they don't get some cut of the university budget. In fact, quite the opposite. There is one department I have in mind right now where the pool of money that they have saved up actually can be accessed by the provost and the president of the university, and then taken away from them and used for something else entirely. So like because the Kiev, the chatter that is speaking, they live in Europe, so their university system is very different. But like here in the United States, I mean, so much of it is
There is
privatized, or at least, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
very serious problem in history education right now. There is effectively a corporate capture of history education occurring in the United States. I have sat and thought about job prospects. Having this conversation alone is probably going to give both of us problems if we ever look down the road to job prospects. Let's be frank. To be perfectly, to be like having like, oh, you said nice things about Palestine, you didn't denounce Hamas. No job for you.
The horror.
Uh,
Yeah.
There's a intellectual capture happening here in the United States for history, very particularly, and some of the other social sciences too, because history sits at a weird intersection of the humanities and social science.
Right.
There's very much an intellectual capture going on, and you see it very plainly in the anti-DEI stuff happening right now. That's horrifying all its own. But like, and where you are in Europe might make a big difference too, because like I know, for example, Hungary is basically uh their history departments have become Islamophobia factories. So I don't want to discourage people from getting an education. Education is important, but bear in mind that it's going to become harder and harder to do over time unless we reverse this course. So like that's one of the reasons this channel became a thing in the first place, is so that there's a place where you can have more intellectual talks about history that might not exist inside the confines of a university anymore.
Right. No, I mean that was also part of the idea behind my own channel was like I felt that there were students, like I felt that only requiring say a semester or two of history, and it's like this very boiled down, and usually in one example that comes to mind, it's literally just US history, like that's what intro to history is. It's just very simplified American history from like the founding of the Plymouth colony to like 2010 or whatever. And it's not about like historiography or the philosophy of history, etc. Like you can't really get into that. But then the students are whisked away into these other classes, right, where everything's about oh, everything is about having the students spend as much money as possible for their time there. Is at least how it's shown, right? But the chatter asks, do you think when trying to change the direction, we should best look at the lenses people look through and create a rhetoric that fits that lens? So, for instance, frame change as being part of the past instead of conserving things, as in people create narratives to make sense of the world so as to give them a new narrative that fits their worldview. That was the best I could come up with to steer it. Even if you get 10% of the target group, it's a huge political mobilization to the left. So essentially, when thinking about how to change the direction, I guess is kind of what he's trying to ask you very specifically.
I think the question is maybe how I would answer that is like we want to meet people where they're at. If you want me to make a general criticism of, look at people like Andrew Tate. What does Andrew Tate talk about? He speaks to people's insecurities and provides for them an answer. Wrong as it may be, he provides for them an answer.
Mm-hmm.
We do a really bad job generally of making people feel like they are welcome and that their insecurities are valid. So you have to meet people where they're at and talk about the things that bother them and like kind of weave it into this narrative, this overarching narrative. If we make things better for X, Y, and Z, we make them better for ourselves. So if we make things better for, we talk about the structures that make people, the racist structures that keep certain groups of people of color poor in the United States. We talk about fixing that. We also fix them for ourselves. And like illustrate how we're all in this together. The whole point is to kind of recognize where our of intersectionality is to recognize where we have disparate interests that cross and how those things kind of grow over time. So like it makes like economic growth, like the kind of things that stifle economic growth, removing those barriers in some places helps them remove them in others. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but like doing a better job of meeting people where they're at and illustrating how the solutions help everyone.
Right. Like it's kind of like that, again, it's kind of like a team is only as strong as its weakest player, right? And again, I don't necessarily, or it's, I mean, not even weakest, but it's like its least trained player, et cetera, things like that. Like, because we have such huge gaps in generational wealth, right, when it comes to BIPOC, because we do have all of these things, right, like anything done to alleviate those things only benefits everybody else. Like that has been shown time and time and time again. Anytime you address those things systemically, everybody benefits, right? And that is why addressing people's concerns by saying that there are actual ways that we can approach them, is, again, kind of like what you're saying, right? Like part of not only accepting people's anxieties and being able to relate to them, right? Because again, we might have disparate interests, but they do intersect. But also the fact that everybody benefits if anybody benefits in the long run, right? And the more people that benefit, the more people that benefit, so to speak, right? It's one of those, I forget what,
pathologically frustrating conversations, but yes.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think my chat wants me to do an Aaron Sorkin monologue. Government's a place we can all come together, says Toby. But no, it's we see the greatest advantage in collaborating with one another. We are, aside from all of our differences of perception and perspective, everything that we might say divides us, we are at the end of the day social beings who are supposed to work together.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, do you have one of your Furbies?
He is clamoring for attention. We might actually have to wrap this up pretty quick.
Well, in that case, I don't want to keep you. I understand you have a lot of things to do, but this was a very wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed having this discussion with you. Hopefully, we can chat again soon. Again, thank you very much. And there are thank yous from the chat. Thank you again.
Yeah, I
really appreciate it.
I appreciate the invitation.
Okay.
All right. But other than that, have a good day. I am gonna have to take care of animals now. They're gonna get. No, we're not doing that, Jump. No. Everyone, have a good day. I'll talk to you later. Have a good one.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yep. Okie dokie. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Hope you all have a good day. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this stream. It helps me out immensely. And have a good night.